All right, so today we are going further with using CSS on the front end, in particular with React. And we're going to be learning about some CSS frameworks, or you could call them UI component libraries, that do a lot of the heavy lifting with CSS for us and offer a lot of advantages. We got deep into the guts of CSS yesterday, and that's really important because that gives us a foundation to understand how to use these things. And now these tools can do some of the legwork for us. And we're really going to introduce two different approaches today. First, we're going to look at something called Tailwind. And Tailwind is basically called a CSS framework. And what that means is the folks who created Tailwind have made a ton of CSS classes and IDs and breakpoints and stuff like that. And then it's been designed for us to use. And let's take a quick look. We're going to take just a quick look at the Tailwind website, the Bootstrap website. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the problems and challenges are in working with CSS that cause these things to be created. So Tailwind, its goal is very much to be lightweight. It gives you a bunch of CSS classes to do all the different things that you want. And we can sort of see it in action here. And we'll be using it in a moment where I don't have to create this class like space -y -4. And that in fact does some spacing for me. And W96, W80, width 72, width 64. These are classes that will set a width, background color, white, shadow, rounded. And the idea is it's a lot of little utility classes that I can combine together to kind of compose what I want. And that Tailwind does a lot of that work for me, but it's all CSS at the end of the day, which makes it very flexible. The other library that we're going to look at a little bit later is Bootstrap, which has been around for ages and was originally created by Twitter. And it, while it is also a CSS framework like Tailwind, it is way more heavyweight and offers a whole lot more. And in fact, it has like components, basically. Like you can have buttons, headers, nav bars, layout. So Bootstrap has an awful lot of JavaScript to make these components work. So there is CSS for Bootstrap, but also JavaScript. And we'll look at this in part 2 of the lecture, but just to kind of give a preview, we are going to be able to install a component library, React Bootstrap, which is Bootstrap turned into React. And I can grab an accordion component, and then I can use it. And you can see here, there's a lot of stuff I have to do. I can't just use a component named accordion. I have to read the docs, and it has multiple components. But then what I get is this really nice, really well-designed component that has a lot of time and effort gone into its design. And there's just components for everything, for buttons, which you can set to be different colors or different colors based on what they do. There's a whole color theming system. It's really powerful. And some people love it and some people hate it, but it's very good to see. And the reason that both of these things are around is because CSS, people tend to have a love and hate relationship with it. The more you use it and start to understand like really how it's designed, I think the more you start to appreciate it, because it's also solving a very hard problem, right? Let's see, what's a good website to pull up here to look at for CSS? I used New York Times yesterday. Maybe we're just going to use the New York Times
uiverse.io.
again. Sorry?
uiverse.io.
Oh, yes, I'll check that one out in a second. You know, if we're print publishers and we have to design a website that looks good all the time on all screens, that's a hard problem to solve. And that's what CSS solves. Oh, this is something else. I see. So one of the big challenges with CSS is that when it all gets loaded into the browser, it's basically one big CSS file. That was the issue I ran into yesterday, where I wasn't commenting out the import of that part one component, and that part one CSS was still getting imported. So there's no name spacing. So I can only have one CSS class with a particular name. So I have to be really thoughtful with my names. And as my project gets big, organizing my CSS becomes quite complicated. And there have been whole like strategies and schools of thought on how to organize my CSS. And there's something called BEM that's been around for a long time. And the idea was, and Tailwind, I think, borrows pieces from this, naming CSS and like having different kinds of CSS classes, blocks, elements, modifiers. So we would be creating all these different classes based on this whole sort of system. And you can see here, there's like a very strict naming convention that's being followed. There's a button, there's like a state and like a modifier, and we can combine these together and it can be modular and reusable. There's things called like SCSS or SAS that let you start to have variables in CSS. And if we go to maybe not the playground, but if we go to learn SAS, you can start to add variables to your CSS, which is really useful if we want to set up a color theme. There's something called CSS modules now that we'll learn about later that lets you have like name spacing. And there's even something called CSS in JS, which has become really popular and comes and goes in popularity with React, where I can write in my JavaScript code CSS essentially. So a lot of people have been working really hard to tackle these challenges. We are teaching Tailwind and Bootstrap because Tailwind has become quite popular. It's very lightweight and it's focused just on CSS, and it doesn't kind of bring in extra fanciness. And then Bootstrap, it's just been around for ages. It's incredibly well designed. It's mature, it's stable, and it does what it does really well. And I think today, hopefully too, maybe we'll like try to knock out a 3-column layout with one of these things. So we're going to look at Tailwind. We're going to see how to install it. We're going to see how to do positioning, flexbox, colors, pseudo classes, media queries, all the things that we learned about yesterday, and a little bit of using it with React with conditional styling. And then with Bootstrap, we're also going to see how to install it, because it does take a little setup. We're going to look at some Bootstrap components, like I was showing you, buttons. We'll look at the Navbar and how we can start creating our own React components and using these Bootstrap components inside it. And we're going to look at the Bootstrap Grid, which is an amazing layout tool that does a lot of the work of Flexbox for us. So that's sort of the plan for today. Do folks have any questions about the agenda or anything related to it before we dive in? Okay, awesome. So with Tailwind, there's a couple steps to installing it. I've gone ahead, I've already created an empty Vite project, and let me just go ahead and run npm install. And that'll run npm run dev in just a moment. And an awful lot of packages installed there. I'm going to set this up. I just want to make sure that everything works and sort of clean house, so to speak, before we dive into Tailwind proper. As always, I'm going to get rid of everything in app.css. I'm going to get rid of everything in index.css. I'm going to get rid of all this stuff that we don't want in app. Right, and I'm just going to have it return just like an H1 that says, you know, I have. Just so I know everything works. Now that I've done that, I do need to install some stuff with Tailwind. So I am going to stop the Vite dev server. And let's go ahead and let's just look at Tailwind's install docs, in fact. Because as you start using these libraries, you are going to have to read their docs. We're introducing these things to you and showing you how to use them, but these are powerful, complex tools and documentation to figure out how to use all the different parts is a necessity. It's not optional. You won't be able to get very far if you don't start reading docs. And so with Tailwind, we're just going to do the normal Tailwind install. We don't need to worry about post CSS, which is this very cool technology that we can look at a later day. We can actually go ahead. Let's actually look at maybe their installation here for Vite. That would make even more sense to make our lives even simpler. We already created our project, so now we're right here. And in fact, they do have us installing post CSS. You don't need to worry about post CSS. Just know that what happens is when we run npm run dev or npm run build, post CSS is a program that is like doing some processing and modifying of our CSS to do a whole variety of things to it. So let's go ahead and install this stuff. And I believe the D is for dev dependency. Though that doesn't feel right because this isn't a dev dependency. Though post CSS and auto prefixer are, because these are used just to generate the final form of our CSS, so to speak. And I think that's what's going on here with the Tailwind CSS library as well. And so now we need to use this command npx. It used to be we used npm for this. npx lets us actually run a node module that we've installed from the command line, or even maybe run a node module that we haven't installed. So this is the new way of, if I need to like run and execute a node module on the command line to do something, not to start my Vite dev server or run my React program, but like in this case, we need to have Tailwind do some initialization stuff. I use npx, and npx was installed as part of npm. It's part of npm. And it's kind of telling us what it does. And we see here, we've got some new config files. And we can see that if we wanted to, we could add plugins. We're not going to have to worry about this too much. Just like we had a Vite config file, we also now have a Tailwind config file. And there are a couple things we're going to be doing to this. So as I mentioned, the cool thing and the power of something like React is all the cool stuff that we're seeing it can do. The complexity is there's a lot of layers. And as you may have noticed with npm run dev or the npm run build command, there's actually a lot of stuff happening to our JavaScript code. It gets transformed. It's called transpiling. And that's how that JSX syntax, right? Like this stuff ends up being normal JavaScript that the browser can read, because the browser can't actually understand this. Like if I hop over here and let's just take a very quick look at our JavaScript code. And it may not. Yeah, I apologize. It is the DevTools has gotten fancier and fancier as time has gone on, and it's actually harder to show the actual code. So I'll circle back to this another day to show what our JavaScript code actually looks like. But you don't have this JSX stuff in your JavaScript code when it's sent to the browser. It gets modified. And I apologize, that's a little out of scope, but that's the context on what we're doing now with this Tailwind config command is there's going to be processing of our CSS that's done for us. And we kind of need to tell Tailwind a little bit how to do that. I need to tell Tailwind where to go to look for all the CSS it needs to do stuff to. There might be some CSS at index.html, so that needs to go there. And then we are using those Tailwind CSS classes in all of our source code files, app.jsx, mycomponent.jsx. So I need to tell Tailwind where to go to find those as well inside the source directory. And then the 2 stars is it means all directories inside this. And then I'm saying, well, what kind of files should you pay attention to Tailwind? And really, we want Tailwind to pay attention to all the files. If it has a .js file extension, we're not using TypeScript, but we'll add the .ts file extension just in case. JSX, which we are using, because that's the file extension we use for all our React components. And if we were using TypeScript with React, we would have TSX. So now Tailwind knows where to go to find stuff for what it needs to do. And now we also need to add a couple lines into our index.css that are basically importing stuff. And this is, as you can see from this VS Code autocomplete message, this is essentially going to import a whole bunch of Tailwind's own CSS into index.css. And then this way, when we're using Tailwind CSS classes everywhere else, they can find those classes because they'll be here. And this is why when we create our own CSS, we wanted to go in app.css and save index.css for stuff like this or Bootstrap. Like this is index CSS is really like setup type stuff. So we need to make a couple imports here. And import these Tailwind CSS classes that we'll need. Now, fingers crossed, I should be able to run my code again.
I think in your Tailwind config file, you left off a curly bracket at the end of that line 5.
Oh, I totally did. Thank you so much. Yeah, that is, you know, I normally say not to copy and paste stuff. This is the one situation where maybe copy and pasting is okay. And the reason is VS Code is not able to give me any sort of hints about this because all VS Code knows is this is a string. So that can be potentially a very difficult bug to track down. That said, config file stuff for Tailwind config is notoriously tricky. You should not be modifying this file. If you are, you should be very careful to make sure that you know what you're doing or be getting help from someone who does. So you do not want to play around with these kinds of config files. Like we tell you exactly what you need to add in the curriculum, in the lesson content, and it's exactly what I'm doing here, and you should do exactly that and nothing else. And I really appreciate the heads up on the typo, because that would have been a pain. And now I've got my app running, and I've got a div, and I've got an H1. And we're not even seeing any of the normal styling applied to it. It looks like maybe some Tailwind styling, in fact, might already be applied. And if we go here to computed styles, or if we go to styles here and look at it, we can kind of see all this stuff -- TW. These are Tailwind classes CSS classes that start with 2 dashes as a sort of naming convention. And so there is all sorts of stuff being added here. Like if we find font size 16px, where does that come from? Well, it looks like it's inherited. But we can see that this has definitely changed. So let's start using Tailwind to do stuff. The one last setup thing I do want to do is there are a couple VS Code extensions we recommend using with Tailwind. They're in the curriculum lesson doc, so I'm not going to drop links. But it's this one right here by the creators of Tailwind that will give you some nice IntelliSense or autocomplete type hints. And this one I already have installed. And this one called Tailwind Fold. I see there's a newer one out. Let's see, I want to make sure I have the right one. So in fact, I am going to click on the link. Yeah, this is the right one. Oh yeah, and it's got 120,000 installs. Perfect. So, and I'm going to leave it disabled for now, but we're going to have lots and lots of classes that we're applying on elements, and it can get really long, and this will fold and hide and show them. And interestingly enough, there was also something with viewing the Tailwind docs here in VS Code. That's a good one as well. And that one's probably worth installing. All right, now that we've talked about that, let's go ahead and let's actually do some stuff with Tailwind. Right, we've kind of been building up to this. So with normal CSS, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a little bit of a split because we're going to mostly be working in app CSS and app JSX in the app itself. You know, if I wanted to make my text red, maybe I would make a class like this. How is my font size with VS Code, by the way? Should I bump it up or are we good?
It's a little small in my opinion.
Yeah, I forgot to bump it up. How's that? Actually, how's that? Is that good for folks?
Good for me.
Thank you. Perfect. Okay, if I need to bump it up again, just let me know. Right, and we've learned I would apply this CSS class to whatever CSS I want. And now, right over here, my little bit of text is red. And in fact, right, it's a little small for us to look at on the screen. So, and this is where, you know, I don't want to add the font size to make it bigger. So I'll leave it there for now, but we'll let's just for fun, let's say we wanted to make it, I don't know, 48 pixels big. Right? Or maybe 48 that's rem, which is massive, right? Can someone remind me what rem is? Rem and em from yesterday?
Isn't it dependent on if it's like important, right? Like it's an important text. That's how I understood it.
Close. Daniel, yes, sir.
Is it rem the root font size?
Yeah, exactly. Rem is relative to the root font size for the whole document. So if I have this working right, so yeah. So I set the font size for the whole document, which I'm doing here by setting the font size for the HTML element that is the document. Rem is based off of that. One rem is the exact same size as the font size for the document. So this is 48 pixels. 2 rem is twice as big. 3 rem is 4 times as big, right? And that's why 48 rem is just insanely massive. We can't even see it. So let's go back to like 8 rem. And then if we decide that we want the font size for the whole document to get smaller, this changes. EM is font size relative to the parent element or container. Rem is relative to the root font size of the whole document. So I think just for fun, I wanted to throw a little rem and em in there so we could see this in action and we could make this get bigger. And let me change this back to 1. And let's change this font size maybe to like 32 pixels. So we can see this a bit better. So this is what we're used to doing. This works great. It has a lot of advantages. As we can see though, my CSS class is already starting to get a little messy. I've got color red, I've got font size. Like what if, I want all of my red text to maybe also have, some text decoration underline. But I don't always want it to be the same size. I maybe want the font size in a separate class, like text size 1 or whatever. And then I want to use both of these classes together. And this gives me flexibility, right? We're sort of trying to follow the single responsibility principle, separation of concerns. Makes it easy to use this whenever I want my text style that way. It makes it easy to use this whenever I want my text of a certain size. This ends up being a lot of work. And in fact, this is what Tailwind can do for us. And let's kind of see what that looks like in action. Chris, yes, sir.
Question. So you have text red and text size 1 in the same header. Can you put 2 different colors? Like, can you put blue in text size 1? Will it overwrite the red for text red?
Yeah, great question. Let's do it. Color blue.
So no,
And it does overwrite it.
Oh, okay. I was just curious.
Yeah, no, great question. And in fact, let's watch what happens if I switch the order of these two things. I am actually a little surprised.
You'd have to change.
Oh,
sorry.
yeah. Change the order of it here in the app.css file. Let's
So it
see.
goes top to bottom. Ah.
Yeah, I got confused. It's not over here, but it essentially goes top to bottom, right? In terms of if I have multiple CSS classes, how they get applied.
Okay, I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And the truth is, this is a pain, right? To be honest, we don't want this. This is a problem. And this is part of what Tailwind does for us, because Tailwind has done a lot of work to do all of this work for us.
Okay.
Yeah, and let me go ahead and just get rid of this stuff. And we're gonna have empty class name. And now I think what I should be able to do is text dash red. Let's see here. Let me make sure I have my syntax right. Daniel, yes, sir.
Do you have to import Tailwind?
I thought I had it imported in index.html. But it's possible there's a step I skipped. Let me make sure I have the syntax right with this color. First of all, and then let me see if I need to use to import stuff. Oh, you know what it might be? Let's try. There we go. Okay. This always gets me with Tailwind, but this is a good learning opportunity. So let's talk about what's happening here. And I am going to bump the font size up just a bit to talk about this. That was definitely a good thought about if we need to import Tailwind, but we already do, because if we go to main.jsx, I import index.css, right? And then here is where we render the app component. So we've already imported index.css for everything before we run app.jsx. And then here in index.css, I did import Tailwind. So there are a lot of setup steps. So let me add a little comment here, and let's talk about what this syntax is. Tailwind lets us do a lot of really powerful stuff with its utility classes, and this is why it's called a utility library. The syntax for this command is text and then all of the different properties. So I can't just have color. I also have to have the font weight, more or less. Or really, excuse me, I should say maybe like color gradient. And let's see, text blue 100. It doesn't seem to like that, or did I lost my comment? There we go. And let me unhighlight this so we can watch this change as I change it. So this is, right, the intensity of the color, how much transparency there is. And Tailwind requires us to have this. And as you all saw a moment ago, when I just had text blue, there is no default class for that. And that's why that wasn't getting applied. And in fact, we can see VS Code has done its like Tailwind something, because all of a sudden now this little blue thing has shown up here, showing that VS Code is recognizing Tailwind. And if I hover over this, we can in fact see the text itself, and opacity is the word that I was looking for there. And so Tailwind has just tons of classes. Like they have gone ahead and written that CSS class text blue 700, and that's why we can use it. There's a lot of other things that Tailwind gives us. It gives us everything for the box model. And in fact, I'm just going to close this out and this out because we really no longer need those anymore. It gives us padding and border. So let's do maybe border. Let's do something maybe like, and in fact, now I'm getting some really nice VS Code autocomplete hints for the Tailwind classes that I have available. And there's an awful lot of them. And this is where the docs are helpful. And my guess is border 4. That sounds like a border of 8 pixels. Or border 4 is border of 4 pixels around everything. Let's see what we do. And so now I can see that we have a bit of a border around our element. And it almost definitely has a depth of 4 pixels as we see right here. And if I only wanted like a border, say, on part of it, I believe it would look something like that. And if we scroll through these, we can see all of these different options for border spacing, border X, border Y, top and bottom. I think T is probably just for top. My guess is R is for right. Yep, here's border L8. And now we have a little border just here on the left, border left 8. So the syntax is a little dense, but the more we do it and the more we get used to it, the more useful it is. And we don't need to make our own CSS utility classes anymore because Tailwind will do this for us. And let's say I want to do a border of 8. Let's see if maybe, do they have like dotted as an option? It's probably some shortcut that I don't remember, so I'm not even going to try. And let's go ahead and let's also add some padding. And here, and take a look, by the way, at this VS Code. Note that Tailwind defines its padding in rems. So the padding is going to be relative to the document font size, which means everything is proportional, right? So that's kind of the cool thing about you set the font size for the HTML element for your whole document, or you let Tailwind just use its defaults. And then everything, including padding and margin, is proportional and based off of that. And that all of a sudden just makes your layout look better, right? Because that's a huge design principle. And we see here, you know, the pixels, my guess is that's like, you know, based on whatever the default setting is, that's how many pixels that is. So let's add padding 8 everywhere. And now we see a ton of padding has been added. And we can see that here. And just like with border, if instead of padding everywhere, I wanted padding maybe just on, oh, I don't know, the top and bottom. I believe it's probably PY-8. Let's see how that does for us. Yep, and now I just have padding on the top and bottom, right? Y as in top and bottom, X as in left and right, and L for left, R for right, T for top, B for bottom, if I wanted to do padding to individual parts. And I was saying the other day that, you know, our paddings should really be to the right and to the bottom. So let's change this to, oh, I don't know. Let's change this maybe to padding L. Let's push my app out a little bit, right? I think that would be fun. And let's add a little bit of margin too. And let's add some margin to the right. Let's add a margin of 8 to the right. Let's add a margin of 8 to the bottom as well. And Chris, yes, sir.
So are you telling me we don't need the CSS file or do anything in that CSS file? Yeah, we can do everything here, basically.
Essentially, yes. There is probably going to be some CSS that you want or need to create yourself. Like if you want to do something particularly fancy or maybe with a media breakpoint or something, but you can do an awful lot here yourself. So yeah, you're bang on the money, and that's why a lot of people love Tailwind.
So essentially, we can do everything here, like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Here in app.jsx, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, essentially. The difference being we're not creating CSS classes here, right? We're using the ones that already exist in Tailwind that we installed.
Right.
Yeah, but you hit the nail on the head, and that's part of the beauty of Tailwind. Brandon, and yes, sir.
The custom custom CSS that you're talking about, those are called mixins, right? Am I
Mix-ins are something else.
okay?
I would have to refresh myself. Yeah, that's a good question. All I meant was, and let me just go ahead and do it here just to show. Like my special CSS. Like maybe we want like
Okay, so just raw CSS. I got you.
yeah,
I
exactly.
appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Like CSS can do transitions and animations and all sorts of crazy stuff. So you know, there might be a reason it might just make more sense to make a CSS class for certain things. And then I can use it here just like any other CSS class. If I can just remember what I named it, my special CSS. And I shouldn't have given it, I really shouldn't have named it that way. Let's fix that there. And that underline, text decoration underline that I added to my CSS class, we see that applied here. Because that's the beauty of Tailwind. It's just, there's all this stuff that Tailwind kind of does for us, but at the end of the day, it's just CSS. And so I can write my own CSS and throw it in the mix too. And every now and then you might want to, but Chris, exactly like you were saying, most of the time, you can probably do it just with Tailwind. Chris, yes, sir.
And so we use the document to see what we want to make it look like, I guess. Correct?
Ye-
Like, yeah.
Use the what? I'm sorry.
The document of was it tailwind.com or whatever the website
Oh,
was.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, the Tailwind docs. You're gonna, as you can tell, there's an awful lot of commands. I do recommend installing those VS Code extensions, especially the Tailwind docs one. Like if you type Tailwind into here, you'll see it. Because I'm not sure which parts of that VS Code autocomplete you all were seeing are from which extension, but it gave me an awful lot of help.
So download all the extensions for Tailwind. Is that what you suggest?
No, I would suggest we mentioned two in the lesson doc specifically that I mentioned a little while ago. I would install those two, and I need to add this to our curriculum doc, but this one here, Tailwind docs. And
And
let me just, yeah, exactly.
what's the other one?
They're in the lesson doc.
Okay, lesson doc. Gotcha.
Yeah, you can see it. You can see it. They're in the sort of install step in there.
Cool.
Totally. Yeah. And so you raise a really good point here, Chris. That the documentation becomes more and more important. Tailwind does have components that do even more. If you want to explore that, you can. That's not what we're looking at right now. Just so if you start seeing like Tailwind components, you don't get confused, as that's a little different from this. And then in terms of where to go in the documentation, because it's always, I think, a little tough to find stuff. What you want to look for is this always drives me nuts. Here we go. Let's look through the Tailwind documentation for a minute, actually, because documentation is I think one of the best things about my CS degree was my professor forced us to read a lot of documentation. It's very much a learned skill. So with documentation, some sites are better than others. There's always a bunch of junk you just kind of want to ignore. You always want to look at the getting started installation. Most of this stuff you can skip. Editor support, we already kind of talked about. This stuff you can skip. The core concepts, I would recommend taking a little time to read this through Tailwind. They also sort of teach it to you, and frankly, they do an incredible job. And you can see they're showing a lot of these utility classes, and this is a lot of what we're going through today. To be honest, the more we get into these frameworks, the more the documentation is actually a really good resource. And there's a lot of useful things they'll talk about here. There's some stuff that's a little more advanced. Customization, you can basically ignore for now. That gets more advanced. But you can see there's interesting stuff. If you want to customize Tailwind, you can. The part that you want here, other docs will call this like the reference or the API reference. They're just not calling it that. You want to find the part of the doc that actually explains the thing, right? And it takes a little digging sometimes. And here in the Tailwind docs, it's this part here where I can go through and find all of the different classes for layout. Right, and here are all the ones for flexbox and grid, and they have these incredible examples that we're gonna do in just a minute. Padding and margin, like I was showing just now. So here they list all of the padding classes, all of the margin. Again, honestly, their documentation is pretty great. They've put a lot of work into making it easy for developers to learn this, because that's how, Tailwind came out, I don't know, 6 years ago, something like that. So, that's part of what we have to do as software engineers, right? Is be able to learn new technologies, and thankfully good companies put out documentation. And then, where I should have started off is right here in the docs going to text color. Because then I would have seen here that the rules about the text colors, confusingly black and white, I can just do text black and text white. All the other colors, I need to add the opacity. So you're definitely going to want to have the Tailwind docs open in a browser tab, and this is why developers love multiple monitors. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but that was a great question, Chris. And as you all can see, the docs are really, really useful. Tim, yes, sir.
So when you were saying the opacity, how does that work for black and white? Or like want something to be gray then so I can set the opacity, or
That's probably exactly it. That's
Okay.
probably what they do. Yeah.
thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And you can actually, guys, you can see here with the docs, they say quick search for anything K. So like black, maybe text black. So just, or maybe like opacity. So the documentation is very, very nice. And we'll leave this up there for now. And as we get more into Tailwind, I'll try to kind of show the relevant bits of the docs as we go through it. So we've seen a lot of good things with Tailwind. One thing I want to point out is part of the reason why using Tailwind with React can be a lot of fun is now that I've written all this, maybe I want to make it into a component. And let me go ahead and just delete that comment. And I'll just make a components directory just for fun. And we'll call it components, of course. And let's say I'm going to make a file, and let's name it header.jsx. And let's say I'm just going to steal all that stuff that I wrote and drop it right here. And I need a little help from React. So I want to use a child, which is something we haven't talked about a ton. There we go. That's exactly what I want. So I'll kind of refactor this in a moment, but let's go ahead and format this. And this is why that Tailwind claps extension is useful, because this is already super long, right? This H1. Let's just go ahead and import my header, and let me make sure that I export it. And let me make sure I haven't done anything silly. I wanted to, if I'm just returning one element, I don't need those parentheses. That's what I wanted to do right there. Let me go ahead and import header from components header, and let's use it right here. And now with my fingers crossed, I've got my header and I have all that CSS there. And now I have a whole lot of headers. But this isn't very useful to have my header always say the same thing. Maybe I want to be able to mix it up. So there's another way to do it, but for now, I think I'm just going to show it as the way that we've seen with props. So let's pass in a prop named title. And over here, instead of my app, we can just say title. And now I can do, you know, title, hello, and I can mix it up. I like title, goodbye. There is another way to do this with what's called children in React. And let's see if this works, and if not, we'll just move on. And what do I mean by children? Well, just like we might have an element and have something inside it, like if I wanted to put a div here with something inside it, I could do header hello and put some text inside it. And whatever's inside there is the child of this React component. And because that's a basic behavior of functions, React gives us the children prop for free. It always exists. And the advantage of this is that this just looks more like what we're used to with, you know, headers and H1s and H2s and stuff like that. Right? We could do it with a prop as well, but this is a little cleaner, I think, when we're reading this code. So that's the really cool part with Tailwind and React components together, is my component can hold all of my relevant styling, and then I can just use the component. And I just want to pause and check in and see if folks have any questions. Cool. How are we feeling about this stuff? Are we feeling pretty good? Are we maybe feeling even kind of excited? Awesome. Chris, yes, sir.
Can you go back to the header?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just pull it up as a split, in fact.
Gotcha.
I'll put the header. I get a little obsessive about the order that stuff is in.
Okay, so why is this a red line here? Is it misspelled or something? Or for children?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. That's because if there's something that we can do with React called props validation, where using some stuff that we haven't seen, I can, in this component definition, say exactly what props it should be and what types they should be. And we just haven't gotten there yet. And it's a little tricky to do because sort of the way to do that now is with TypeScript, which is sort of a language on top of JavaScript, like JavaScript plus more, that's a little out of scope. So that is a good thing to be aware of. If you see a red squiggly and the reason is it says something is missing in props validation, we can safely ignore it. And what I do is I'm just going to this quick fix here, and I just disable it for the line so I can make the squiggly go away. Tim, yes, sir.
So is it similar to like basically calling yourself in a function?
Is
Like
what
Python?
similar to calling yourself in a function?
So you're like children is your input here kind of thing, and then kind of like instead of it's like putting the F function in front of it for a variable that hasn't been called yet, kind of thing?
I think so. You have the right idea that this is very much a function. And this is taking in a bunch of arguments. And in fact, it takes in an object. And by convention, we call that object props. And so I could do props.children, and that would work just fine.
Okay,
Yeah. What React actually does, I sort of tried to demonstrate this the other way, but it didn't work, was it takes the children and each of these things that I add here, right? And maybe you know, I'll just stick a number in there. But I could have some JavaScript in here, right? Like
Mhm.
let's just, you know, x equals 7.
Yeah.
Instead of 7, let's
X.
yeah, exactly. So what React does, and I need to put a const on that. What React does is it takes each of these properties and it bundles it up into an object. And so if I
Gotcha.
wanted to, I could do props dot foo props dot r. And
So you're
and-
kind of like calling parts of the function that you need, almost. Sounds like.
yeah, it's the function just takes in an object as its argument.
Okay,
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. React does that work for us. And then exactly like you're saying, because so much of the time, what I care about are the properties of this JavaScript object. We just destructure it right here.
so you kind of like skip the props part and just put in the function part that you need to
Yeah,
call from the object, I mean.
yeah, these curly brackets, that's the
Yep.
props object. We're just breaking it up.
I get it. Thank you.
Yep, nope, you're welcome. Yeah, great question. And this is good stuff for us to review. And then I would just do this. We can also do this, by the way, just to kind of like, as long as we're talking about this, to kind of take it home. You can also do destructuring like this. And this does the same thing, right? And you can kind of, if you think about it, here's the object on the right side of the equals, and it's kind of feeding everything into the other side of the equals, and we're grabbing these properties off of the object. But if food didn't exist, you know, then we'd have a problem, right? Because we'd be trying to grab something that doesn't exist. And I don't know if it throws an error or not, but we're not seeing anything. And just because we do this so much, just the convention when writing React is just like, hey, let's just do it this way. Awesome. Let's take 10 and then we'll look at flexbox with Tailwind. Sound good to folks? Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you all in 10 minutes. So we've made these components. We've seen how this is the child of a React component. And then if I go into my header component, we see here, we pass in the props and React gives us that child as a prop. And we're now using all of this Tailwind CSS here to style our component, which is really cool, right? Because now I have a header I can use everywhere I want. And I should probably run the Vite dev server, which is why I'm seeing npm this thing over here. And I was pushing some code, so let me quickly hop back into my project directory. And now let's run the Vite dev server. And now everyone is happy. So let's look at Flexbox with Tailwind. And to do that, I'm just going to build it out here in app. And I'll give us a little space. Yeah, I think I'll leave this stuff as is because I don't want to lose that code. But we are going to focus on this other stuff now. So I'm just going to write in a bunch of divs. And maybe we can break it into components later, but for now, I just want to really get going with this and using this. And the Tailwind CSS docs are pretty incredible here, as we can see. And in fact, I'm just going to code up some of them as we go. And let's just do flex row. And let's just make a couple divs, right? We'll do 1, and we'll do 2, and we'll do 3. And if I hop over here, I see my 1, 2, and 3. And maybe let me add, let's add some stuff to make these divs a bit more interesting. Maybe we want to do something like, how about padding 8, margin, because padding is in rems, that's way bigger than I thought. I was thinking pixels. Let's do padding 2, margin 2, and let's do maybe like border solid. Oh, orange. I like it. We'll do border solid orange. It looks like, in fact, I've got something wrong with my border. Let's look at the header. Let's try getting rid of the S and see if that works. And let's try getting rid of the color and see if that works. And maybe like border 2 pixels. And probably orange was maybe, or 100 was a bit big, because I keep forgetting. I was thinking opacity, but this is probably the number of pixels of the border. So let's just keep life simple. And now we can see our boxes. Let's get rid of the margin so that we have our boxes more boxy. And so now we've got something nice that we can play with as we use Flexbox. If I want to reverse my Flexbox and reverse the order of it, I just add flex row reverse. If I want, instead of a row, I want it to be a column, I can just do flex column. And again, I can do flex column reverse if I want to reverse the order of the things in that column. Right? So all of the sudden, we have really powerful Flexbox features at our command. And the Tailwind docs do a great job of showing this, right, as we go through here. And I think the one thing I want to show is this responsive feature, where we can actually use a breakpoint to switch from row to column. And let me add a little comment here explaining what we're going to do. For small screen sizes, do row. For medium and large, and I have it reversed, I want to do a column for my small screen sizes and a row for my medium and large ones. And what you'll see, Brandon, kind of like you were saying, like there's a lot of common concepts shared between CSS frameworks. And Tailwind, along with Bootstrap, they've already gone and figured out how many pixels wide an iPhone is. And a common convention is you'll see different screen sizes, small, medium, large, and sometimes extra large, and a whole bunch of breakpoints already written for those screen sizes, so we don't have to do that work. And most of the time, that works great for what we need. So let's go ahead and try this out. What I want is I want let's leave the default as a column, right? So that will be for small. For a medium size, let's have it be flex row. And I'm gonna make my boxes bigger. Maybe like a width of 4. Height 4. And it looks like I'm still getting used to there we go. That I think now we're getting to a size that's appropriate. There we go. That I think is nice and big so we can see something interesting happen. And here again, you can see how if I was doing this for real, I might want to make like a box component so that I have all this stuff there already. And let's add one more of these. So we have enough to see something interesting happen. So fingers crossed, when I make this screen small enough, this should collapse into a column. And there we go. So, and let's in fact just bring up the incredibly useful dimensions, and we'll have it set to responsive. Or if I want to see how this looks on an iPhone, right? On a small screen size, or on an iPad, or with responsive, I can change it. And we see that right around like 700 something pixels is when the breakpoint from the small screen size to the medium size exists for Tailwind. And just for demonstration purposes, not that we would want to do this, let's just have the large screen size go back to let's make it flex row reverse, just so we can see. And in fact, we saw it happen right there for the large screen size, is it just flipped. And there's almost definitely an extra large screen size as well. So now we can see these breakpoints in action. Large, medium, right? It went from 4, 3, 2, 1 to 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, we wouldn't actually want to do this when designing. This is just for demonstration purposes. But the shift from row to column, we do very much want to do when designing, and you've all seen that happen on websites, right? And so this is how we can use Tailwind for responsive design. There's a whole section here on responsive design. We can see here the breakpoints, small, medium, large. In fact, they have extra large and 2XL because screens are pretty big these days. And you can see they're telling you what the breakpoint is. And they use min width, so it applies if it hits that size or it gets smaller. And then they just go into more detail here on how to do it. They explain how their breakpoint system is designed to be mobile first, which is a good thing. And they have some advice here about how to best design a layout for mobile screens using flexbox. And interestingly here, they're actually saying don't use small to target mobile devices. And they give some good advice here that's a pretty common bit of advice these days, though for learning purposes, you may not need to worry about it, which is when you design something, design it for mobile first, and then add on changes, like design it for mobile first. And that's kind of what I did here. The default setting here is column. I didn't specify column small. I said by default, column. That's mobile first. And then I said, okay, when we get bigger screens that aren't on mobile, let's do something different. And then you can customize the breakpoints and you can go way more into it. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that we can do here, but that's I think a pretty good overview of Flexbox. And I just want to check in and see if folks have any questions. Momo, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I just want to know if I wanna, when I make the port view smaller, if I want just all the component getting smaller, just use flex without no flex column, without no flex anything. You know what I mean? Like make it just smaller. Doesn't turn into column or when it gets smaller.
Oh, you absolutely could do that. You can use that's a very good point, actually. We can use this breakpoint for really anything. Let's use the breakpoint to increase, let's say, let's increase the width of these when it gets bigger. Let's do, and the way, so MD colon is the syntax for these classes. MD, I think, stands for media query, like media breakpoint. Or no, I'm so sorry. My brain is confusing me. The size of the breakpoint, small, medium, large. So let's say large width of 48. And I think that will work. Let's give this a shot and see if this works. So the syntax for CSS rules specific to breakpoints is the breakpoint size, small, medium, large, colon, and then whatever the other Tailwind thing is. Whatever the other Tailwind class is. And I'm actually not 100% if this works for everything. Let's see here. So hopefully what will happen now is the width. Yep. It is. And if I had the dash here in the others, it would work with the others as well. Yeah, so I can set it so on a larger screen, these boxes are wider. When and it's a little hard to see. I think let's try actually changing this to like maybe I think it's working, but let's try changing it to like background color or something like that. And I'm actually gonna use ChatGPT to remind me Tailwind background color. BG dash, which makes perfect sense. So let's see if this works. Let's do, yeah, like BG red 200. That seems like a good one. BG red 200. And there we go. So indeed, the media breakpoint does work for any Tailwind CSS property. And I think it is working for the width here. It's just a little hard to see. What can also be a little confusing is the media breakpoint rules are for minimum query. Sometimes it depends if you set it like a min or a max, if it's going up to or leading from, but in general, it should work just fine where we hit the breakpoint and then it changes. So I can say for small screens, I want the width to be smaller, or I want the color to be different. And for large screens or medium screens, I want something else. Does that help answer your question a bit?
No, I'm sorry. I just meant if I want the component here, like 1, 2, 3, 4, doesn't turn into column, just getting smaller. Shall I just make the MD or S or whatever the breakpoint, and for the first dev class name flex, shall I cancel or delete
Yes.
flex column?
Got it. Yes, I believe so. Yes.
Yeah, that was my question. Thank you.
Got it. You're welcome. What else is on people's minds? Okay, let's talk a little bit then. We've talked a lot about positioning. We've talked about flex. You can use all of the justify center and item center that we've seen with flexbox as well. Like if I add to my flexbox, justify center. There's not a lot to justify here because they take up a lot of space. But now all of a sudden, those things are centered. Mikhail, yes, sir.
Yeah, I see that you can go from row to column, but can you change the actual position of the whole boxes using that, or is that going to be difficult?
What do you mean by change the position of the boxes?
So you see how it's like right under goodbye, if you could bring it lower on the screen.
Say that again, right
It's
under
like-
goodbye.
Like a few pixels from the bottom of the viewport. So that whole row, 1, 2, 3, 4, if you can bring the whole row down to be where 4 is right now.
Oh,
Or is that difficult to do? Like how would you do that?
you mean, let me grab the annotation tool for a sec. You mean you want to see like a row of 1, 2, 3, 4, you want?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it go from where 1 is right now, that row, that position where 1 is. So when you get to a certain ratio, it brings it down where 4 is right now, where you have that annotation.
Yeah, you could do that.
But it's like hard to do. Like it's not easy.
It takes a little work, but probably two things. The way so if I was to do it, the way I would think about it is, and I apologize that this is terrible, but 2 boxes in a column, right? And this one, and let me grab like a typing thing from the annotation tool. You know, margin gets big when viewport gets small or something like that. So it just pushes it down is basically what you're saying. So that's how I would do it. Like it's like layout is all about boxes and containers and putting things in containers. And so when we want to do something like move a whole bunch of stuff around, we want to put it inside a container, right? And in fact, that could be interesting for us to try out. Let's give this a crack just for a moment to see how far we get. And then we'll switch gears.
I didn't want to derail the class with this question, but
No, it's all good. And this, I think, is actually like I wanted to show a bit of a 3-column layout anyway. So let's quickly like make a couple divs and do some stuff in them. Because this is whether it's, we're going to see this in a bit with the Bootstrap grid as well, where we really start thinking about this stuff. And in fact, let's just get rid of one of these headers and let's just put this one here, right? Because this kind of makes sense. Now, right now, not a lot of interesting stuff is happening because let's see what my elements are doing. To make sure I didn't do anything silly, first of all. So that looks right. And can anyone tell me why is my header to the right of that box of the 1 box? Mikhail, yes, sir.
I think because your class is a flex, and I think because it's in medium, so the flex becomes a row.
Yeah.
So that's why side by side.
Yeah, exactly. This is row, let me highlight the correct thing. And in fact, it's even more confusing because I have large flex row reverse. And let's get rid of the reverse just for sanity. And now things are actually in probably the order that we want. And now when I highlight this, it'll make sense. Column 1 of our row, column 2 of our row. Exactly like you were saying, right? And so let's take this stuff. Let's put it here. Let's get rid of it here for now. So I have two containers, right? And at the moment, they're just normal divs inside this big container. I've got my big container. I've got one container. I've got another. Now this second container has all the flexbox stuff. So it still does all the things that we want it to do. And you were asking, well, like, what if we want to push it to the bottom, right? Well, let's add some rules. First of all, since we don't want this to go from row to column, let's just leave it as flex row and leave it at that. Right, and now I make it smaller. Flexbox is just kind of sizing things and not doing that much. But because I have these two containers, I don't even know if I need Flexbox to make this happen. We can probably use a media breakpoint. There's probably a more elegant way to do this, and the reality is it would just depend a ton on what the actual content was, because making like a massive margin just to stick something at the bottom isn't a particularly good idea, right? Like what a better strategy would be maybe is to like hide it entirely and then show it here in a different form. It really depends on what it is that we're talking about. But just to illustrate it, let's add here using a breakpoint for a small screen size, let's say margin of 8. And let's see what happens now with this as we do this. And maybe that margin is not big enough. Let's try something like 48. And let me add my, and that margin is definitely big enough. Though it looks like interestingly, it looks like the margin is not getting applied when it gets small, which to be honest is confusing me a bit. Like here, there's no margin. So I think I have my rules backwards. I'm not sure why that's happening with this. I'd have to dig in a little with Tailwind. It may just be they kind of want us to do it the other way, where like, because they do, it's probably because they talk about mobile first design, where like that's what they want the margin to be. And then for medium, like we should set the margin to something reasonable, like 2. And for large, we should set the margin to something reasonable, like 1. And maybe that's why Tailwind is doing that. And also it needs to be margin bottom, right? Not just margin everywhere. So I'd have to investigate, and now we get the behavior that you're talking about. And so the issue I was running into there, and in fact, it's a good reason to read the docs, is that Tailwind is a mobile first design. They don't want us setting rules for like the small screen. They want us to design it the way it should look on a mobile device and use the breakpoints to add elsewhere. And so now we get that behavior that you're talking about, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, that's good enough. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. All right, that was good to see. It was a bit of a detour. The really useful thing with this is containers and flexbox inside flexbox, right? Like we could make this a flexbox to do something with if we needed to. So I think that's really the important takeaway, is that like actually by having the one big container and a container for one part and a container for another part, it actually gives us a lot of power and flexibility and control. So I just want to quickly demonstrate pseudo classes with Tailwind, and then I think we can switch gears and look at Bootstrap. So pseudo classes are pretty straightforward. And remember, can someone remind me what is a pseudo class in CSS? Brandon, why? Yes, sir.
There's like the hover and like on like before and after, and then it like whenever you do something to an element, it changes the CSS how you want it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And let's add some hovering here for our header. Pseudo classes are how like CSS does interactivity. Like if I click on something to focus on it, or I hover over something. And just like we saw this syntax of like with breakpoints, the class name is the breakpoint size and a colon. Here it's the pseudo class name and a colon. So hover colon, and let's say background blue 300. And now hopefully, and I might need to exit responsive design. There we go. So that my mouse in responsive mode, it was sort of simulating, you saw like if I was moving my finger above the mobile device, that's why you saw that circle. It wasn't actually the mouse pointer. Now it's the mouse pointer. And now when I hover over my header component, the background turns blue. Something we can also do related to kind of color and theming that's pretty cool is dark mode. This does take a little bit of work to set up, but let's see what it looks like in action. I do have to go to the Tailwind config file to make this happen. And I do have to add something to it. And I want to make sure I put this in the right spot. So, and we might need to update our lesson doc a bit because it explains it just a little differently, or maybe Tailwind changed something. But what are we seeing here? Export default. And this is a JavaScript object, right? The syntax is a little funny, but it's an object at the end of the day. Like if I wanted to, I could do const config equals my object. And export default config. Right? And this maybe looks a bit more familiar. But since there's only one object and this file only has one job, Tailwind's designers have just written it like this. And so we need to add something to this config object. And this is a really common pattern with JavaScript where there's a config object for stuff. And what we need to tell it is that there's going to be a new CSS class named dark mode. And let's add some code so that we can have dark mode in action on our site and see what this looks like as we kind of put these pieces together. So we're going to have to do a couple things. First off, I need a parent div for my whole app because that's what I want to flip the switch on to go from light mode to dark mode. So instead of a fragment, let's make this a div. Because now we actually have a use for it. And it would help if I put the slash in the right spot with my div. And we're gonna need to add some classes here. We're gonna tell Tailwind that the default background color is white. All right, if I wanted to, I could make the default background color blue. So, oh, because I'm forgetting the opacity as always. And in fact, this doesn't quite do it for us because this is not the whole HTML document. This is just, if I look at the elements, remember all our HTML is created inside this div with the ID of root. Everything that React.js does, we can see right here, this is this div right here in app.js, right? And normally we don't have to think about this too much, but now we might actually need to change some things elsewhere in our React app to get like a true dark mode working. Though often with our React app, this might take up the whole space. So this isn't going to work. So I'm going to undo those changes. And we'll go back to just having our fragment. So here is one of the few times when we might actually need to modify index.html. There is probably a better way to do this, to be totally honest, but this will get the ball rolling. So now, right, I modified the body element that has everything in our HTML doc. I don't want the default background to be blue. I want it to be white. I just wanted to do that for demonstration purposes. And as you saw, that was actually some useful debugging because I was on the wrong path there for a moment. So that's why it's great to test as you go. Now that we've told Tailwind, hey, there's going to be a dark mode, just like we can sort of use this modifier pattern of a special case, colon, and then the other thing. We're telling Tailwind, hey, when we switch to dark mode, use this CSS class, dark BG black. Right, and this is probably a media query as well of some sort under the hood, though not about display port size or screen size. Though actually, we may just be, I apologize, I think we are just going to be modifying this directly and flipping the switch. So this is a little bit of a hack. There's probably a better way to set up this theming, but this is actually a pretty good way of doing it. It is certainly not bad. And just for fun, let's put this in our header, because why wouldn't we want to have maybe our dark mode here in the header? So in here, let's make a button. And let's have it say dark mode. Let's have it say toggle dark mode. And we needed to do something when we click on it. So let's add an onClick. And with an onClick, we're going to need some sort of function. So let's make a handle toggle dark mode function. And let's just have a console log click. And we're passing in the function as an argument. We're not calling it in here. Right? It'd be nice to have some spacing with this button. So let's add a little bit of margin here, maybe like margin 4. How about margin left 4? How about margin margin right 4. Excuse me. Let's try margin right 8. And oh, I already have margin right 8. That's why I was getting a complaint. What if we bump this up to 32? Oh, I see. I apologize, folks. I got a little confused there. And in fact, I need to pull this button out of the H1. And let's put all of this in a div. My apologies. That was what was going wrong there. And let's, in fact, let's use a little flexbox here. Flex row. And now we're getting closer to what I wanted. And now let's try increasing this margin right to, oh, I don't know, 32. So not perfect, right? But we can start to see how all these pieces can be combined, and we have just flexbox inside flexbox inside flexbox. And in fact, I could use flexbox to position to the positioning of these rows, of these columns in the row, instead of margin. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to, but that would actually be the better way to do it. But let's get this dark mode up and running. So my click works. So let's do what we need to do to actually change the CSS class that's being applied to the body element. So I need to grab the HTML element from the document. And this is a bit of a hack to do in React, but every now and then you need to kind of go outside the React way. And we're going to get elements by tag name. And let's try body and see if this works. And I'm just going to call this L. Because I might need to tweak something, but let's see how we do here. And let's set an attribute on it, and we're going to set the class, and we're going to get the attribute class. And my apologies, let me get my syntax right here. We're going to do a little bit of a ternary here. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at what it already is. And if it's set to dark, we're going to flip it to light. If it's set to light, we're going to flip it to dark. And I think there's a couple other things I'm going to have to do here to get this working, but this should at least get the ball rolling for us. So my apologies for the jumping around. And after this, we'll definitely break, and then we'll look at Bootstrap. So the click is working. I'm not sure if we are properly. We are indeed updating the class, the body class. We can see it happening right here. But I think we need to do a little more work to make this happen and actually work. And I suspect the mistake I made was this, in fact, may need to be on the parent HTML element. And now that's working, and I'll explain why in just a moment. And let's add one more thing to the button here. so that we can see things nicely and also see this in action. And let me do a little formatting so this is going to be easier to read. Here in the CSS classes, let's make the text black by default. But if we're in dark mode, let's make the text white. And I just did a little reformatting there so that my button is here. And I've got the first prop and the second prop, the child of the button, the H1 with all of our CSS and its children. And so now I've got a really simple dark mode set up and working. And let me explain why I got a little confused there and what I got wrong. And why this works the way it does. And let me go ahead and we can actually just look at it here in the element inspector. So the HTML element is the parent element of body, right? In fact, if we go here, we can see this really clearly. Here's HTML. And then inside that, body is a child. So, and I need to do a little more digging, I think, to like really exactly understand how Tailwind is doing this. What this does is when the parent elements class changes to dark, it applies this rule, right? Because that's what we have here. We have this class light and dark. And it doesn't do anything. We're not really doing anything with the light class. That's just the name we're going to use instead of dark so we can keep track of stuff. Well, when it goes to dark, we are making a change, right? So we put this Tailwind rule on the child body class inside the parent, on the child body element, excuse me, inside the parent HTML element. And then with my button, we change the parent HTML element. And that's what we're doing here is we change the parent HTML elements class from light to dark. And then that triggers the Tailwind rule. Daniel, yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is it possible to use a use state for the class get attribute to set it to like light and dark using a use state? Is it possible? Oh, Adam, you're mute.
Thank you. That is a great question. Let me take a look at that. We absolutely could create some use state here. However, it won't work. And there's a very specific reason why, or rather, it won't be very useful for us. And Daniel, do you want to take a crack at, or maybe like phone a friend and ask like why, if I want to change the class of the HTML element, React's use state isn't going to help me?
Is it probably because HTML is like the whole DOM? Question mark.
Yeah, you're on the right path, right? Our whole React app lives inside this div right here with the ID of root. And you know what we've seen with use state is I could like have some use state and I could do like, let's say we did like the import use state. And we do something like, const dark mode class set dark mode class equals use state light, right? And then over here, maybe we want to do something like set dark mode class dark. And then, what we've done before is in here, I would do something like dark mode class, right? And obviously we wouldn't want to do it on this particular div because this is just our header. We need to have it happen for the whole document. So if we go into app.js, maybe we could do it on this div. But that was the problem I ran into just a minute ago when I was testing the background color. That doesn't cover the whole document, right? So there's no React component that our HTML element lives inside, because this is the parent element of the whole HTML doc. React is handling everything inside this div ID root, but it can't access anything outside of it. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, it's a great thought. It's a great question. And it's actually really good to cover and a good example of how, like, most of the time with React, we can say totally inside React, but every now and then we have to step back into the world of like HTML and the browser and CSS. Momo, yes, sir.
So I don't make this the React, the component in the body.
That's a good point. We might be able to do that. You know, basically you're saying like, hey, why don't we do something like ID equals root and mount our whole React app on this HTML element or on the body element. I actually don't know if that works. It probably, I don't think we could do it here because I think that would probably break something. We might be able to do it here without breaking something. I'm honestly not sure, but we wouldn't want to. I would actually have to do some digging, but my first thought is I think the browser would get confused and something would break. Also, every now and then we need the normal HTML stuff, so there's other reasons why we always want the React to be on a div inside of the body. But that is a really interesting thought. Awesome. I think there's one other Tailwind feature I want to show very quickly, and then we can take a break, and then we'll look at Bootstrap. Though it is so much fun playing with this dark mode toggle, I have to say. And that one other Tailwind feature is essentially what's called a peer. And let me show you what that looks like. And in fact, let's just do that right here. So remember with the unordered list yesterday with CSS, we could actually apply rules to the first element in the list or the third element in the list or the last one. Peers is sort of a similar concept. Let me give another class here of peer. And then what I can do here is let's make a little paragraph and give it a class. And Tailwind has a very useful utility class invisible that does exactly what it sounds like. It sets display to none. So if this doesn't show up at all. And we're going to use sort of a pseudo class combined with a peer and do peer hover visible. And so hopefully what happens now is when I hover over this, that paragraph tag becomes visible. Right? And in fact, if we wanted to use some use state here, this would be kind of a cool use case actually for some use state. Let's in fact do that right now just so we can see it, because I think this is useful to see in terms of patterns. We're not going to use this use state to actually change whether it's dark mode or not, but we are going to use it so React can keep track of it so I can change my message. So what we'll do right here is I think we'll just add we'll just we'll just do it right here after the change happens, and we'll see if we have to tweak this a bit. We're going to flip that Boolean. And then what I can do down here is in my message, we can make it a little Star Warsy. And let's put this inside some React code. And let me go ahead and put those there and make this a string. And is dark mode, if it's true, we'll say like join the light. And if it's false, and let me make a little more room so we can see what we're doing, we'll say go to the dark side. And then what I'll also need to do is add that bit of Tailwind, where in dark mode, the text is white. And we're also going to need to, I think, set the default text to be black for light mode. So as you can see, there's a lot of, like, these pieces start to interact a lot as we want to make our user interfaces fancier, but we have a lot of really nice tools. Right, and that's a great example of how React use state is valuable, because otherwise, how else would our component know if we're in dark mode or light mode? I just want to check in and see if folks have any questions before we break. Chris, yes, sir.
Are you posting this video? Is there a way to post this video on GitHub, like the recordings? So I'll have to keep trying to find it on YouTube.
Short answer is no, but if they're hard to find, Francisco and I can definitely do something with the playlists to make it easier. Maybe
Aren't the
like put
links
some
on GitHub?
bookmarks or something. Though I would also just encourage you all to start getting in the habit of bookmarking stuff, because once you get out into the field, there's just going to be a ton of things you have to keep track of. But we can like gather all the playlist links in one place. We can definitely, yeah, we can do that, and we'll find a good spot to put it, maybe on the curriculum readme or something. That's a good idea.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Let's take 10. Yeah, let's take 10 and then we'll look at Bootstrap. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good break, and I will see you all in 10 minutes. All right, so now we're recording. We have installed Bootstrap and React Bootstrap, and we've added this all-important line to import the Bootstrap CSS into main JSX. And just like before, I can tell that it works because all of a sudden my hello looks a little different. And if we look at these styles, we see that there's all sorts of things that Bootstrap has done for us. And this is sort of the default Bootstrap style. So this is where Bootstrap kind of starts to get a little fun, because it turns out that it has components for everything. Absolutely everything. And the place in the Bootstrap docs that you're going to want to hang out, we're going to look at layout in just a minute, mostly grid. Forms is also good, but also components. That gives the breakdown for every individual component. And so just to get started, let's add a button. And this is a live editor. And it's up here, right? So I can actually edit this code, and it's updated live. So these docs are really incredible. And I think part of the reason why Bootstrap is so popular is they've done a lot of work to try and make this as easy to use as possible. So let's go ahead and add this button to our code. Oh, and I do have to be careful with the autocomplete. And note that we're importing it from React Bootstrap, and that we're importing the button component. There's a couple different ways to import stuff from React Bootstrap. This is the way we'll be doing it most of the time. And now I can go ahead and use this button. And we learned about children, right? React children. And so we kind of know what's going on here with this button component now. And it looks like I made some sort of mistake. And this may be, maybe their docs need to be changed, or maybe I read something wrong from their docs. Import button from React Bootstrap button. Let's see what I'm doing wrong here in my import path. Let's try this one more time. I'm going to kind of use VS Code to help fix my errors. Import button from React Bootstrap button. And let's try this again and see if it works. If not, I think I know what the issue is. There we go. So I honestly don't know what I did wrong there. I must have had some sort of typo. Sometimes just deleting it and typing it again is the best way to solve the problem. So the next obvious thing we want to do is get something to happen when we click on our button. For this, we need to look a bit at the docs and kind of go to the next level of the docs. Though the on click, just like any other button, is the quickest and easiest way to do it. But what there also is in the docs is there should be, like, let's see where their API reference is. Here we go, API. So they hide it a little bit, and I had to expand this to see what I was looking for. If I go down here all the way to the end, we can see all of the props that we can pass in to the button component and what they do, right? The application programming interface, the controls for the button component, variant, and all the different parts. So sometimes, you know, in the docs, these live examples are really nice, but if you need to dig into the details, just remember to make the browser wide enough so you can see it here and go down to the API bit, and then they break down all the different options of the button. And there's a lot of cool stuff: active, disabled, a regular on click. So let's just play with a couple of these things real quick to see it in action. And then we'll look at another more complex component, and then we'll look at layout. So on click is, you know, what we've all seen and are used to. And I'm just going to have it click for now, and we'll add an on click handler to our button. We'll add this handle click function. Now I can click. Something that's very useful is there's a disabled property. And if I set it to true, then all of a sudden I can no longer click on the button. And this is something that's really useful. Maybe this is a bit of React component state that we're changing somewhere else, right? And for sort of Booleans like this, I like the convention of it should always start with a verb, usually is. And you know, we could like make another button to toggle the other button disable other button. Right, and here we can just write a little arrow function and do something like set is disabled to the opposite of whatever it last was. And so, we can already see now how we can use useState to hook into these React components to do a lot of like interesting and powerful stuff. A lot of the Bootstrap components actually get quite complex. One of the most useful ones and one of the more complicated ones is the Navbar. And let's take a look at this in the docs for a minute because it does an awful lot. And this is where I'm going to break my rule and do some copying and pasting. So the Bootstrap Navbar component is responsive. So it does all the responsive stuff for us. I don't know if we can see it in the example, but let's see if, yep, we can even see it in the example. We hit a breakpoint. Those navbar options went to this hamburger menu in the corner, including a dropdown. We get bigger, it changes back. So you can't just dump the navbar in and use it. It's a little too complicated. My rule of thumb with stuff like this is actually when it's a good time, I think, to start by copying and pasting. Though, as always, if you take the time to actually type it out, I think that's even better. But when you're getting started, don't actually change this stuff because you're still learning how it all works and it all interacts a lot. And it is worth taking a little time to read through this because we see there's a lot of things here. And a lot of it is about sort of like standards of web design, like a brand here. And a brand is a logo that's also a link. Note how we have this href tag right here. It's an anchor link going to home, going to nowhere. But so this is how we can add our logo with a home link. Note that we then have like this navbar toggle that doesn't seem to do much, but we need it there for some reason. There's no children. And then we have this collapse and a bunch of stuff inside of it. And here we see the home and the link and nav.dropdown, a dropdown component with nav dropdown.item components for each item, right? And each of those can be a link the same way that we see right here. And they're all inside the collapse. And that's why when we hit the breakpoint, everything inside that collapses into the hamburger menu. And in a moment, we'll copy and paste this in our code and see it in action. But I just want to walk through it now and note how there's also a container component that we'll talk about in a minute that does some layout stuff and how I need to have all of these together to get the whole navbar working. And then it is worth taking some time, to read through this. And you can see they have different, like a different navbar example. And again, if we go down to the API, they, in very thorough depth, break down what everything is doing. But the best way to get started with something like the navbar is honestly, again, I almost never recommend this, but copy and paste. And let's in fact just make our own navbar component and put this stuff inside it, because that way our app.jsx doesn't get super cluttered. So let's go here and let's make a directory named components. And let's, oh, I made that a file, so I'm just going to delete it. Let's make a directory named components. So a word of caution. I am going to name this component navbar. It can be confusing to have the names be the same as the Bootstrap navbar and get the import path wrong. It's an incredibly easy source of errors. in general, I actually try to avoid names that are the same, just as a habit until you sort of build up the workflow where those errors are less common. So I'm just going to name this my navbar and just head that problem off at the pass. And we know we're going to need to return stuff. We're going to have it be a fragment. And inside that fragment, we'll just put like an H2 and we'll just say navbar. And I know I'm going to need to do export default my navbar, right? So let's start with all of that and add this to app.jsx. So we have my navbar and it's working. And this stuff, I'll just put below the navbar since that would make sense. And now we can add the Bootstrap stuff into my navbar. So now I am going to copy and paste those imports from here. And I am just going to copy and paste this basic example. Again, I think the most important thing with copying and pasting is you have to take the time to do some reading through before you do it. Otherwise, you're just going to set yourself up for pain and suffering. And then once you do always have to spend some time reading through it to make sure names aren't different, there's not a missing import, and taking a little bit of a look. But we can at least just very quickly go and we see that now this navbar is working. And now, without having to do anything, I have a really nice navbar, right? And we have the hamburger link. And just to demonstrate the collapse, let's take home out of the collapse and put it here. And see what that collapse is doing for us. Right, and here's everything inside the collapse, everything outside of it. And we can see that indeed, now that I've pulled home outside of that collapse component and it's no longer a child of that collapse component, when we hit that breakpoint, it does not go inside the hamburger menu. Right, so navbar, super cool, very powerful, has a lot of moving parts. Let's take a look at and actually let me pause it and see if folks have any questions. So I've been going on for a little bit. How are we doing? Are we kind of excited about Bootstrap? Does anyone have like strong feelings yet on like Bootstrap versus Tailwind? Like just from seeing them today, like which one you feel like you want to spend more time with? Brandon, yes, sir.
I personally would rather use Bootstrap, just because I like the basic setup that they have, and it's kind of like universally good looking.
Yeah.
Tailwind is still really awesome. I just think that like Bootstrap is a little bit more straightforward.
Yeah.
Especially because you can also, I know we're using React right now, but Bootstrap is also just like very fast to implement in HTML as well.
Yeah.
So like you can, you know.
I would agree with all those things. And I think they're all great points. And they kind of do different things, right? Like if we wanted to create Bootstrap, we could kind of use React and Tailwind to do it. And I think, you know, there's really not one right answer. Sometimes people will say there is. There's an argument to be made for rolling your own or building your own with Tailwind because you learn more CSS, your components do exactly what you want them to do, and it's actually very flexible and simple. The flip side is Bootstrap is incredibly well designed. It is super batteries included. You can be very productive with it very quickly. And I don't think there's one right answer. I think they both have trade-offs. So as long as you're aware of the trade-offs that you're making, I think they're both great tools to have. And let's take a look now at the Bootstrap layout to see some of what you were talking about too, Brandon, about how everything is just kind of set up nicely. So just like with Tailwind, Bootstrap has breakpoints and they give us the pixel sizes here, extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. extra large. You can make custom breakpoints. I'm probably not going to talk about Bootstrap forms. I apologize for switching gears. Before I dive into layout, I just want to mention forms for those of you that are interested, and you can explore it later. If you are interested in forms, they kind of have a whole forms system where you can create form groups and labels. Like here's the label for for the email address. And it can do an awful lot of form validation. Like that gives me, hey, this is supposed to be an email address. And I'm pretty sure it's doing it because if I dig in to where that form control is, right here, type is email, right? So if I change that to text, it works just fine. So Bootstrap forms are incredibly powerful. You can disable forms. You can have like nested select menus. You can do a ton of stuff. I don't want to dig into it too much. Also, because I think the docs are good enough that you all can get that bus driving on your own. But I wanted to point it out because it is pretty cool. And just like with the Navbar, the way to get started is literally copy and paste the basic example, take like 10 to 15 minutes to read through the docs, and then start tweaking stuff. But, you know, copy and paste this into your code and get that working first, and then modify stuff. Any questions on forms before we move to layout, where we will do some writing of code? Okay, awesome. And like Brandon was saying, this is a good example of how Bootstrap does give you an awful lot of great stuff right out of the box, which is really cool. Like just the same way there's that email input field, there's input fields for everything. So layout is where Bootstrap kind of gets awesome. For the longest time, the grid system has been how layout works. You all saw me like showing like a 3-column layout, like your classic, like if you start looking at websites this way, you'll see it everywhere. A navbar with your page title and whatever else, and then your 3-column layout. Like if we go to the one I love to use, the New York Times, let me grab the annotate tool real quick. Right, this is a terrible drawing that I'm making, so I apologize. Let's make this like 1,000 times thicker. There we go. Right, they include the ads in there, but this is the nav bar, basically. And of course, the nav bar itself is a bunch of rows, you know, and like there's the little menu bar row right there that I'm doing the terrible job of drawing. But you can see how with flexbox, it's all like rows of grids of stuff. And this is, it looks a bit like a 2-column layout. What they've done is they want their stuff centered. So they've got basically one big column, and then they've got a lot of margin on the left and the right. Right. And then they basically break it into these 2 columns here. You know, and here's a box, here's a box, here's a box, here's a box. And if we scroll down a bit, note how the header part aside, everything else really stays in those 2 columns. Right? So like this column row box UI design pattern is incredibly powerful. Like right here, you know, we just need to make a box that has 2 rows in it. There's a couple other patterns that you'll see as well. The hero layout. Brandon, if you don't mind throwing that link you shared earlier in Slack, that could be good to see, though I think that was more components. Bootstrap actually has a hero component. This is a great example of a hero page. So this guy right here, we have Navbar, giant. This is what's called the hero text because it's like the title and it's giant. And then as we scroll down, this probably ends up as some sort of 2-column layout. You often see like hero and like 2-column layout, or maybe like a 3-column layout, depending on what you're doing. So, you know, 1 or 2 simple design patterns take you very far, right? Our 3-column or 2-column layout. The other pattern is the grid. Because as you all can tell, we already kind of have a grid going on here. You know, like if I let's put this here. Right? This basically is a grid. And so, in fact, if I wanted to, I could ditch the 3 columns entirely and use some sort of grid system with like columns and rows. You know, maybe this is like a skinny row right here. I can use rows, and maybe I want a row that has like multiple columns inside of it. So maybe I could do something like that, or I can put grids inside of grids, right? And so that's kind of, and that's been around for a while. And Bootstrap was, I think it might have been one of the first frameworks to give a good grid system. It was created before flexbox existed, when doing that was a huge pain, huge pain. Now it's built with flexbox and it's amazing. And note that they refer to that same flexbox article that we mentioned. This is literally the one that the entire internet uses to learn flexbox. So grids have containers, and they have rows, and they have columns, right? And let's add a couple of these into our app and build it up and look at it as we go. So let's go over here, and I am gonna, as I said, do a bit of copy paste. I like to try to have imports from other node modules be at the top, and then like my project, my imports like from my own source code be below. I find that a useful organizational method. Let's grab a container. And the idea is that everything goes inside the container. But for now, we'll keep it simple and we'll just have like a row. And let's see what this looks like, and we can play with it a little bit. And so it's nothing fancy yet, but that's kind of nice. And maybe we want another row. But maybe inside this row, inside this column, maybe we want like another row. And we want like maybe just 2 columns in here. Um, and it's a little hard to see, but let's pull out the element inspector. And we can kind of see here I have the row. Though my row inside of a row may be giving me an issue. And as I grow this or shrink this, everything stays in proportion. And you know, in fact, maybe what's a little more interesting is like some sort of two-column layout. So maybe it's not that we want like a bunch of columns in a row. Maybe we want a bunch of rows in our column. Right, and now, and in fact, let's maybe just get rid of this row. And now I have a two-column layout, right? Two columns with rows and one thing inside each. And I can also do some really nice things with responsive design. And let's go ahead. Let me do a couple things. Like let's do class name equals maybe what, like border. Oh, I didn't install Tailwind here. I think you can use Tailwind with Bootstrap, but don't quote me on that. I actually have to check. Because I very much wanted to, but I haven't installed Tailwind, and I'm not going to try and do it now. But actually, Bootstrap gives us a whole bunch of similar kinds of classes. So we probably don't want them together. Border for, or how about background? Oh, slate 300. And it looks like that may not be working the way I want it to. So I may have to circle back to that one. Let's try class name. Yeah, let me circle back. I apologize. I don't remember quite off the top of my head the Bootstrap classes for the colors and stuff like that, but they're there. We'll come back to it at the end of the lesson. I want to focus a bit more on the grid. Though, let's see if let's actually do a quick search and just Bootstrap class background color column. And we may have to tweak. So I think I will come back to that. I apologize. There's a couple interesting things we can do. There's what's called this fluid property that gives the container full width. And we can put divs inside of these as well to do stuff, which makes it a little more interesting. Like it doesn't just have to be text. I don't think we'll be able to see the fluid example that well with what we have up here, but let's see what happens. And in fact, we did see a difference there. If you noted, this stuff moved over to the left. And if we take a look at our elements, what we see here is this container fluid takes up the full width, except for a little margin at the ends that Bootstrap is adding for us. That I shrink or grow that, that's always the case. And without it, and by the way, what this is this is the same as this. And we can see here that the margin is much bigger now. And so that's some Bootstrap behavior. And in React, if you have a prop that's a Boolean, React has given us a shorthand where I can just add the name of the prop when I want it to be true. And if I don't have it there, it's false. Right, so this container fluid in and of itself is super useful. The other thing let's look at is column width. And this becomes super useful, and it's very similar to what we saw in Tailwind, where I can set for my different breakpoints how wide each column is. Right, so I can set the width for different settings. And I can do it for my different columns. And let's try it with these two main columns and maybe have one stay full width, but one get smaller as stuff gets bigger. So let's have this one on the left. Maybe this is our sidebar menu. So let me just add sidebar to all of these so we can identify this. So now we have a sidebar, but I don't want my sidebar to be like super big. Right? If I look at this right now and I dig in here, my sidebar takes up half the screen. So let's say on like even like Excel screens, we only want it to be a width of like 2. And even for XXL, we only want this column to have a width of 2. And for medium, we want it to have a width of 2. And I think the Bootstrap grid system is 1 through 10. I have to double check. But I believe that's how their grid system works, is it's laid out with 10 cells, or columns in each grid. I do need to double check that to make sure that that's correct. It's either 10 or 12. But what we can do here with this column is when things get small, let's have it shrink to 1. Right, and for extra small, maybe let's have it shrink to 1 as well. And so now, right, and notice how when this got really small, the grid just collapsed everything for us. And did that flexbox trick. And if I look here, I can see how my second row takes up most of the space, but by using the grid, I can have this row, which I can have as much stuff as I wanted, which is awesome. And maybe, like this one here, maybe this is like, list item 1. I don't think the grid is wide enough to accommodate it. But in fact, there now we see it can take up a bit more space. Right? Because it has 2. And then everything just collapses when we get small again. So that's the Bootstrap grid. It's super cool. I did run a bit long, so I think this is probably a good stopping point. And I just want to check in and see what questions folks have. How are we feeling about Bootstrap grid? Are we feeling good? Okay, awesome. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. They're both great tools to have. And the assignment today is pretty open-ended. Excuse me. Really, the goal today is literally build something with Tailwind or Bootstrap. Right? Create a project with React, use everything you've learned thus far. Do something so that you're using use state and use effect. If you haven't, try out maybe like making an API call to the Pokemon API with use effect. We can show we'll show more of that, I think, tomorrow. Use some components and props and use either Tailwind and Bootstrap. And that's the plan. So thank you very much. And let me stop the recording and then we'll just quickly run through the schedule and break.